Good evening. Tonight we're diving into a story that glitters with disco balls and reeks of pharmaceutical hubris. A tale of a pill that promised everything and delivered catastrophe. A drug that was supposed to be safe, that doctors handed out like candy, that became the heartbeat of an entire era's hedonism. Before we begin this journey into the rise and spectacular fall of what would become known as America's love drug, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in this kind of deep historical investigation. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your world. It's always fascinating to see this global community we're building. Now, silence your notifications, settle in, and let's begin. Before it had a street name, before it became synonymous with velvet ropes and Hollywood excess, before it was Ludes, or disco biscuits, or wall bangers, it was simply a molecular formula, methaqualone, a synthetic compound born not from the soil like its ancient cousins, but from the sterile precision of a chemistry lab. The year was 1951. The place was India, in the research laboratories of a company that would soon become part of the pharmaceutical giant we know today. A team of chemists led by Dr. Indra and Dr. Raghubir Srivastava were engaged in what seemed like noble work. They were searching for a cure for malaria. The disease was, and remains, one of humanity's oldest killers, a microscopic parasite that has shaped the course of empires and decimated populations. The search for anti-malarial drugs had become something of a holy grail in pharmaceutical research. What they created instead was something entirely different. In their synthesis experiments, combining various chemical compounds, they stumbled upon methaqualone, a quinazolinone derivative with a complex molecular structure. When they tested it, they discovered something unexpected. It had no effect whatsoever on malaria. What it did have was a profound ability to sedate. It was a powerful hypnotic, a substance that could quiet the mind and relax the body with remarkable efficiency. This was not the result they were looking for, but in the pharmaceutical industry, as in all of science, sometimes the most profitable discoveries are accidents. The compound sat on a shelf for several years, an interesting footnote in a failed malaria project. But the world of sedative medications in the early 1950s was entering a golden age of sorts, or perhaps more accurately a gilded age. The previous generation's solution to anxiety and sleeplessness had been barbiturates. These were effective, certainly. Drugs like phenobarbital and secobarbital could knock you out cold. But they came with a dark price. The margin between a therapeutic dose and a lethal one was razor thin. Barbiturate overdoses, both accidental and intentional, were claiming thousands of lives. Hollywood had been particularly hard hit. Stars like Marilyn Monroe would later become the most famous casualties of these pills. The medical community was desperate for something safer, a sedative that could deliver sleep without the constant shadow of death. Enter the pharmaceutical company that would change everything. William H. Rorer, Inc., a respectable American drug manufacturer based in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania. In 1962, they acquired the rights to methaqualone and saw in it exactly what they'd been searching for, a safe alternative to barbiturates. Their research and development team went to work, refining the compound, testing it, and preparing it for market. What they found in their initial trials seemed almost too good to be true. Methaqualone appeared to be everything the medical profession had been praying for. It worked quickly, taking effect within 20 to 30 minutes. It produced a pleasant, gentle sedation rather than the sledgehammer knockout of barbiturates. Patients reported feeling relaxed, calm, their anxieties melting away like snow in spring sunshine. It helped with insomnia without the harsh morning grogginess that plagued users of other sleeping pills. And most importantly, or so they believed, it appeared to be non-addictive. The early clinical trials showed no significant dependence issues. There was no withdrawal syndrome observed. The therapeutic window seemed wide and forgiving. It looked like a miracle. In 1965, after years of testing and FDA review, Rorer launched their new drug with tremendous fanfare. They gave it a brand name that would become iconic, Quaalude. The name itself was marketing genius. It suggested quiet interlude, a peaceful respite from the stress of modern life. The initial formulation came in small white tablets, scored down the middle for easy splitting, each containing 300 milligrams of methaqualone hydrochloride. Later, they would introduce a 150 milligram dose for those needing a lighter touch. The pills were stamped with RORA 714 on one side, a marking that would become one of the most recognizable pharmaceutical codes in American drug culture. The marketing campaign was sophisticated and aggressive. RORA's sales representatives fanned out across America, visiting doctors' offices with sample packets and glossy brochures. The message was simple and seductive. Here was a sedative hypnotic that combined the efficacy of barbiturates with the safety profile of aspirin. They emphasized its non-barbiturate chemical structure, positioning it as a completely new class of medication. Medical journals carried advertisements showing peaceful, well-rested patients. The copy spoke of effective sedation and minimal side effects. Doctors, who had watched in horror as barbiturate overdoses mounted, embraced Quaaludes with open arms. The drug wasn't alone in the market. In Europe, other pharmaceutical companies had also recognized methaqualone's potential. In Britain, it was sold as Mandrax, manufactured by Roussel Laboratories. The British formulation was slightly different. It combined methaqualone with an antihistamine called diphenhydramine, which enhanced the sedative effect. In Germany, it was marketed as Revenal. In Japan, as Hymenol. Each country had its own brand names, but the active ingredient was the same. By the late 1960s, methaqualone in its various forms had become one of the most prescribed sedatives in the world. The medical uses seemed endless and entirely legitimate. Doctors prescribed Quaaludes for insomnia, of course. That was the primary indication. But they also wrote prescriptions for anxiety, for muscle tension, for nervous disorders of all kinds. It was given to patients struggling with the stress of modern corporate life, to housewives feeling trapped in suburban ennui, to college students dealing with exam pressure. Some physicians prescribed it for menstrual cramps, others used it as a muscle relaxant for back pain. It became a pharmaceutical Swiss Army knife, a solution looking for problems to solve. The dosing instructions seemed simple enough. For sleep, take 1 or 2 tablets 30 minutes before bedtime. For anxiety, take 1 tablet as needed up to 3 times daily. The PDR, the physician's desk reference, the Bible of prescription drugs, listed it with what seemed like reasonable precautions. Don't mix with alcohol. Don't operate heavy machinery. May cause drowsiness. These were standard warnings, the kind that appeared on dozens of medications. There was no black box warning. No special restrictions. It was classified as a prescription drug, yes, but not a controlled substance. In the eyes of the FDA and the medical establishment, Quaaludes was safe. And for a brief moment in those early years, it seemed like they might be right. Patients reported relief. Prescriptions soared. RORA's stock price climbed steadily upward. The pill that had been a failed malaria cure had become a blockbuster success. But beneath the surface, in the pharmacology that the pharmaceutical companies either didn't understand or chose to ignore, something else was happening. The drug that was supposed to be non-addictive was quietly, insidiously, rewiring the brains of millions. To understand what was really happening, we need to understand how methaqualone actually works in the human brain. This is where the story moves from the clean, well-lit world of pharmaceutical marketing into the messy, complex reality of neurochemistry. The human brain is an extraordinarily sophisticated piece of biological machinery, a 3-pound universe of approximately 86 billion neurons, each communicating with thousands of others through chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. One of the most important of these messengers is called gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA for short. GABA is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. Think of it as the brake pedal for your nervous system. When GABA binds to its receptors on neurons, it makes those neurons less likely to fire. It slows things down, It reduces anxiety, promotes calmness, and eventually induces sleep. Your brain produces GABA naturally, and it's constantly engaged in a delicate balancing act with excitatory neurotransmitters that speed things up. This balance is what keeps you alert during the day and allows you to sleep at night, what keeps your anxiety at manageable levels and your thoughts coherent. Methaqualone, like barbiturates and later drugs like benzodiazepines, is a GABAergic drug. It enhances the effect of GABA by binding to a specific site on the GABA-A receptor. When methaqualone latches onto these receptors, it essentially amplifies GABA's inhibitory signal. It's like turning up the volume on your brain's brake system. The neurons slow down, anxiety dissolves, muscle tension releases, consciousness becomes soft and hazy, and eventually you drift off to sleep. But here's where things get complicated, where the pharmaceutical companies' claims about safety began to unravel. The human brain is not a passive recipient of chemical signals. It's an adaptive system that constantly adjusts to its environment. When you flood the brain with a substance that artificially enhances GABA signaling day after day, the brain responds by trying to maintain equilibrium. It does this through a process called downregulation. The GABA receptors become less sensitive. The brain produces fewer of them. It's trying to compensate for the external chemical interference, attempting to return to its baseline state. This is the neurological foundation of tolerance. After a few weeks or months of regular Quaalude use, the dose that once sent you peacefully off to sleep no longer works as well. You need more. Patients who started on 150 milligrams found themselves taking 300. Then 2 300 milligram tablets, then more. And because doctors in the 1960s and early 70s had been told the drug was non-addictive, they often complied with requests for higher doses or more frequent refills. They saw it as a harmless sleep aid, not understanding that they were facilitating a progressive neurological adaptation. But tolerance was only part of the problem. The more insidious issue was physical dependence. When you've been taking methaqualone regularly for an extended period, your brain has fundamentally rewired itself. It's now operating under the assumption that this external GABA enhancement is the new normal. The natural production and receptor density have been suppressed. If you suddenly stop taking the drug, you don't simply return to your baseline state. Instead, you experience the opposite effect, a dangerous rebound of neural excitability. Methaqualone withdrawal, it turned out, was brutal. It began within 24 to 48 hours of the last dose. The first symptoms were deceptively similar to a bad flu: sweating, tremors, nausea, but then it escalated. Severe anxiety that felt like existential terror. Insomnia so profound that patients would go days without sleep. Muscle spasms and weakness. Rapid heartbeat and elevated blood pressure. And in severe cases, the most dangerous symptom of all, seizures. Grand mal seizures that could cause serious injury or death. This withdrawal syndrome was remarkably similar to that of barbiturates and alcohol, both of which are also GABAergic drugs. In fact, methaqualone withdrawal could be just as dangerous as barbiturate withdrawal, a fact that directly contradicted every piece of marketing material Rora had distributed. The safe alternative to barbiturates was, in terms of addiction potential and withdrawal risk, nearly identical to the drugs it was supposed to replace. There was another effect of methaqualone that the pharmaceutical companies had noted but downplayed: its impact on the brain's reward circuitry. At higher doses, methaqualone didn't just sedate, it produced euphoria. Users reported a warm, pleasant high, a sense of well-being and contentment that went beyond simple anxiety relief. This wasn't just therapeutic, it was recreational. The drug was activating the same dopaminergic reward pathways that are involved in all addictive substances. The brain was learning to crave it, not just to avoid withdrawal, but to chase that feeling of chemical bliss. By the late 1960s, a few astute clinicians were beginning to notice something was wrong. Emergency rooms started seeing Quaalude overdoses. These weren't suicides, like many barbiturate cases, but accidents. people who had taken just a few more to get to sleep, or who had mixed the drug with alcohol, amplifying its effects to dangerous levels. Psychiatrists began reporting patients who couldn't stop taking the drug, who exhibited all the classic signs of addiction: compulsive use, inability to cut down, continued use despite harm. But the medical establishment was slow to react. The pharmaceutical companies, which had billions of dollars riding on methacolone's reputation, pushed back against concerns. They funded studies that seemed to show the drug was safe when used as directed. They argued that the problems were due to misuse, not the drug itself, and doctors, who had already written millions of prescriptions and didn't want to believe they'd been prescribing an addictive substance, were inclined to agree. The official position remained that Quaaludes was safe. The warnings in the PDR were updated slightly, but the drug remained widely prescribed and uncontrolled. It took the street to reveal the full truth, because while doctors were debating pharmacology in medical journals, a very different kind of experiment was taking place in America's bedrooms, dorm rooms, and nightclubs. The recreational users, the people taking Quaaludes not to sleep but to get high, were discovering its true nature, and they were about to turn a respectable pharmaceutical into the most infamous party drug of a generation. The transformation of Quaaludes from a prescription sleep aid to the defining drug of an era didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual cultural shift that began in the late 1960s and accelerated through the 1970s, riding the wave of social upheaval, sexual liberation, and the birth of a new kind of nightlife. To understand how a sedative became a party drug, we need to understand the cultural moment it was born into. America in the late 1960s was a country coming apart at the seams. The Vietnam War had shattered the post-World War II consensus. The civil rights movement had exposed the rot at the heart of American democracy. Young people were rejecting the values of their parents, the corporate careerism, the suburban conformity, the sexual repression. This was the era of turn on, tune in, drop out. Marijuana, LSD, and other psychedelics became tools of consciousness, expansion, and social rebellion. But as the idealism of the hippie movement began to sour, as Woodstock gave way to Altamont, as the radical politics turned violent, as the dream of changing the world through love and acid started to feel naive, a different kind of drug culture began to emerge. The 1970s represented a turn inward, a shift from collective revolution to personal pleasure. If the 60s were about consciousness expansion, the 70s were about sensation and indulgence. The new drug of choice needed to match this shift. It needed to be about feeling good, not seeing God. It needed to be accessible, not mystical. It needed to enhance the experience of the moment, the music, the sex, the connection with other people, without taking you too far out of your own head. Quaaludes were perfect. The first recreational users were college students, always the early adopters of any drug trend. Word spread through campuses that these little white pills, easily obtained with a sympathetic doctor or a fake complaint of insomnia, produced a high unlike anything else. It wasn't the speedy euphoria of amphetamines or the psychedelic visions of LSD. It wasn't the dopey nod of heroin or the giggly relaxation of marijuana. Quaaludes produced something in between, a state that users described as being simultaneously energized and relaxed, uninhibited but not out of control. The physical effects were distinctive. About 20 minutes after taking a Quaalude, usually on an empty stomach for maximum effect, users would begin to feel a warm tingling sensation spreading through their body. Muscles would relax, anxiety would evaporate. But unlike other sedatives which simply made you tired, Quaaludes produced a paradoxical stimulation. Users felt confident, talkative, sensual. The drug seemed to dissolve inhibitions without destroying coordination, at least initially. It created a sense of floating, of being wrapped in a warm bubble of well-being. And then there was the effect that would make Quaaludes legendary. It was a powerful aphrodisiac, or at least it felt like one. The drug didn't directly increase sexual desire in a pharmacological sense, but it removed inhibitions, reduced anxiety, and heightened tactile sensations. It made people feel sexy and reduced their concerns about performance or judgment. For a generation experimenting with sexual liberation, trying to shake off decades of puritanical programming, Quaaludes became chemical permission to embrace pleasure without guilt. The drug had another quality that made it perfect for the emerging party culture. It was a social drug. Unlike heroin, which made users turn inward and nod off alone, or LSD, which could send you on a solitary journey through your own psyche, Quaaludes enhanced social interaction. People on Ludes wanted to talk, to dance, to connect. The drug seemed to break down social barriers without the sloppy, aggressive disinhibition of heavy drinking. You were loose, but you were still you, just a more confident, more sensual, more carefree version. As the 1970s progressed and disco emerged as the dominant musical and cultural force, Quaaludes and the new nightclub scene became inseparable. Disco was more than just music. It was a complete aesthetic, a philosophy of hedonism and escape. The clubs were temples dedicated to the worship of pleasure, dark cavernous spaces filled with pulsing lights, thundering bass, and beautiful people dressed in their finest. The dress code was glamorous: sequins, silk, platforms, tight jeans. The music was hypnotic and sensual, built around a steady four-on-the-floor beat that was perfect for dancing for hours. Studio 54 in New York City became the Vatican of this new religion, and Quaaludes were its sacrament. The club, which opened in April 1977, was the brainchild of two entrepreneurs, Steve Rubel and Ian Schrager. It occupied a former television studio on West 54th Street in Manhattan, and it instantly became the most exclusive, most talked-about nightclub in the world. Getting past the velvet rope required beauty, fame, or the right connections. Inside was a different world, a place where the normal rules didn't apply. The scene was surreal. A-list celebrities mingled with drag queens and fashion models. Business executives danced with street kids. In the balcony, in the bathrooms, in the dark corners of the sprawling space, people were high on Quaaludes. The little white pills circulated as freely as cocktails. Steve Rubel himself was known to carry them in a small container, handing them out to special guests like a host offering hors d'oeuvres. The drug seemed tailor-made for the Studio 54 experience. It kept you dancing, kept you social, kept you feeling beautiful and invincible. Other clubs followed Studio 54's lead. In Los Angeles there was Studio One and the legendary nightclub The Odyssey. In San Francisco, the gay club scene embraced Quaaludes as part of the post-Stonewall sexual revolution. In Chicago, in Miami, in every major city, disco clubs became temples of Quaalude culture. The drug's street names multiplied: Ludes, 714s, after the Rora marking, Lemons, after the Lemon Company, another manufacturer, Disco Biscuits, Soapers, and the evocative Wallbangers, named after the Harvey Wallbanger cocktail and the tendency of high users to stumble into walls. The effect on popular culture was immediate and pervasive. Movies began to feature Quaaludes as shorthand for sex and partying. In the 1978 film Coming Home, Jon Voight's character uses them. The 1980 comedy Where the Boys Are centered on spring break drug use. Later, films like Wolf of Wall Street would depict the drug's hold over Wall Street in the 1980s. Musicians wrote songs about them. Lou Reed referenced them, as did Frank Zappa. The drug became a punchline and a plot device, a symbol of an era's excess. But it wasn't just the cultural elite and the club kids who were using Quaaludes. The drug had filtered down through every layer of American society. Suburban teenagers got them from their parents' medicine cabinets, or bought them from dealers at school. College students used them as a study break reward. Business executives took them to unwind after high-pressure days. Housewives combined them with wine in the afternoons. Truck drivers used them to come down from amphetamines. The drug had become democratized, available to anyone with $30 and a connection. By the mid-1970s, Quaalude use had reached epidemic proportions. Estimates suggest that in 1972, when the drug was at its peak prescription rate, doctors wrote more than 2 billion Quaalude prescriptions. That's not a typo, 2 billion with a B. The drug had become one of the most prescribed medications in America, but those prescription numbers only told part of the story. An enormous black market had emerged, fed by multiple sources. Some pills were diverted from legitimate prescriptions, people who got prescriptions for their own use but sold some of the pills. Some came from script doctors, physicians who ran pill mills, writing prescriptions for anyone who paid cash. These doctors, operating in a grey zone of medical ethics, made fortunes writing hundreds of Quaalude prescriptions a day. Some operated out of storefronts in poor neighbourhoods. Others had more respectable practices, but would write a Quaalude prescription for virtually any complaint. But the biggest source was counterfeit pills and illegal manufacturing. Organised crime had recognised the profit potential. The chemistry of methaqualone wasn't particularly complex. Any competent chemist with the right equipment could synthesize it. Illegal labs sprang up producing pills that looked identical to pharmaceutical Quaaludes, but contained varying amounts of methaqualone, sometimes mixed with other drugs or cut with inert substances. The DA estimated that by the late 1970s, 90% of Quaaludes on the street were counterfeit. The lack of quality control in these illegal pills added a deadly new dimension to the drug's risks. Users never knew what they were really getting. One pill might contain 300 milligrams of pure methaqualone. Another might contain 50 milligrams or 500 milligrams. Some contained no methaqualone at all, just cheap sedatives or antihistamines. Others were contaminated with toxic byproducts from sloppy synthesis. The Russian roulette nature of street Quaaludes would claim hundreds of lives. By the mid-1970s, the darker truth about Quaaludes could no longer be ignored. The emergency rooms were telling a story that the pharmaceutical industry and the medical establishment had tried desperately to suppress. This wonder drug, this safe alternative to barbiturates, was turning out to be neither wonderful nor safe. It was, in fact, becoming one of the most dangerous drugs in America. The overdose cases came in waves. A typical Quaalude overdose looked initially like severe intoxication. The patient would be brought in barely conscious, speech slurred beyond comprehension, unable to walk or even sit upright. Their reflexes would be severely depressed. But unlike alcohol intoxication, which emergency room doctors knew how to handle, Quaalude overdoses could escalate rapidly into life-threatening situations. The respiratory depression was the most dangerous symptom. Methaqualone, like all GABAergic drugs, suppresses the brain's breathing center. At high doses, the automatic reflex to breathe could slow to a dangerous degree or stop altogether. Patients would turn cyanotic, their skin taking on a bluish tinge from lack of oxygen. They would need to be intubated, a breathing tube forced down their throat and connected to a ventilator. Without aggressive intervention, they would simply stop breathing and die. The cardiovascular effects were equally terrifying. Quaaludes could cause severe hypertension, dangerously low blood pressure, and cardiac arrhythmias. Hearts would beat irregularly, sometimes racing, sometimes slowing to a crawl. Combined with the respiratory depression, this created a perfect storm of physiological crisis. Doctors would work frantically, administering IV fluids, oxygen, cardiac medications, anything to keep the patient alive until the drug worked its way out of their system. But the real killer was the combination. Methaqualone and alcohol together created a synergistic effect. The combined depressant action was far greater than the sum of the two drugs taken separately. It was this combination that killed more people than anything else. Someone would take a few Quaaludes at a party, then drink. Or they'd drink first and then take the pills. The alcohol would enhance the methaqualone's effects exponentially. People would pass out and never wake up, their breathing growing shallower and shallower until it stopped. The mortality statistics were shocking. By 1973, Quaaludes were implicated in more drug-related deaths than any other prescription medication. The Drug Abuse Warning Network, which tracked emergency room visits and deaths related to drugs, showed Quaaludes consistently in the top 5 most dangerous drugs. In some years, in some cities, they were number 1. Thousands of Americans were dying every year from a drug their doctors had told them was safe. Karen Ann Quinlan became the most famous case, though she survives today only as a cautionary tale. In 1975, this 21-year-old woman attended a party where she consumed alcohol and Quaaludes, allegedly on an empty stomach after being on a diet. She fell into a coma that night and never regained consciousness. Her case became a landmark in medical ethics and the right to die movement, but it was also a stark reminder of the drug's dangers. Here was a young woman, not an addict, not someone with a long history of drug abuse, who took what was probably a small amount of Quaaludes at a party and ended up in a persistent vegetative state. The addiction stories were equally harrowing. By the mid-1970s, addiction medicine specialists were seeing a new kind of patient, the Quaalude addict. These weren't the stereotypical addicts of the public imagination. They weren't heroin users living on the street or alcoholics drinking in alleyways. They were often middle-class, employed, respectable people who had started with a legitimate prescription and found themselves unable to stop. The pattern was depressingly consistent. It would start innocuously, a prescription for insomnia or anxiety. The drug worked wonderfully at first. Sleep came easily, stress melted away. But after a few weeks, the patient would notice that the original dose wasn't working as well. They'd take an extra pill here and there. The doctor would increase the prescription. Before long, they were taking the drug not just at bedtime, but throughout the day. Not just for sleep, but for any uncomfortable feeling. Stress at work, social anxiety, boredom, sadness. Tolerance built rapidly. Patients who started on 150 milligrams would find themselves taking 1,000 milligrams or more per day, far beyond any therapeutic dose, deep into the range of physical dependence. At these doses, the drug wasn't producing euphoria anymore. It was just preventing withdrawal. Users described feeling trapped, needing the pills just to feel normal, to function at work, to interact with their families. When they tried to quit, the withdrawal was unbearable. The anxiety would return with such intensity that it felt like a heart attack. Sleep became impossible. Some patients would go 4 or 5 days without sleeping at all. The physical symptoms, the tremors, the sweating, the nausea were bad enough. But the psychological torture was worse. A sense of impending doom, of existential terror would settle over them. Many couldn't endure it. They would take another pill just to make it stop. The cycle would continue. The seizures were the most dangerous aspect of withdrawal. Grand mal seizures could strike without warning. Patients who tried to quit cold turkey, especially those who'd been taking high doses for months or years, were at serious risk. The seizures could cause falls, head injuries, broken bones. In rare cases, they could be fatal. Quaalude withdrawal required medical supervision, a slow taper under a doctor's care. But many users didn't know this, or didn't have access to medical care, or were too ashamed to admit they needed help. The sexual assault cases represented another dark chapter in the Quaalude story. The drug's reputation as a disinhibitor and aphrodisiac led to widespread use as a date rape drug. Men would slip Quaaludes into women's drinks at bars and parties. The combination of sedation and amnesia that high doses produced made victims unable to resist or remember the assault clearly. Emergency rooms began seeing patients who had been sexually assaulted while under the influence of Quaaludes, often with no clear memory of what had happened. The comedian Bill Cosby would later become the most infamous case of Quaalude-facilitated assault. In his 2005 deposition, released to the public in 2015, Cosby admitted to obtaining Quaaludes with the intent to give them to women he wanted to have sex with. This revelation, decades after the events, exposed how the drug had been weaponized, how its effects had been deliberately exploited for predatory purposes. Cosby's case was likely just the tip of the iceberg. Countless assaults were never reported, never prosecuted, lost to the drug's amnesic effects and the shame of the victims. The driving-impaired cases added another dimension to the crisis. Quaaludes impaired motor coordination and judgment severely, yet the impairment was often not immediately obvious. Users would feel confident, even euphoric, not realizing how badly their driving was actually affected. They would get behind the wheel and cause accidents, running off roads, rear-ending stopped cars, crossing center lines into oncoming traffic. Law enforcement struggled with Quaalude-impaired drivers. Unlike alcohol, there was no breathalyzer test for Quaaludes. Blood tests could detect methaqualone, but they took time. Officers had to rely on field sobriety tests and behavioral observations. But Quaalude users could sometimes perform reasonably well on these tests, especially if they were regular users with high tolerance. They would be released, get back in their cars, and drive away, still dangerously impaired. The accidents piled up. In California alone, the Highway Patrol estimated that Quaaludes were a factor in thousands of crashes annually during the drug's peak years. People died, not just the impaired drivers themselves, but innocent victims, passengers, people in other cars, pedestrians. Every week, newspapers carried stories of crashes where toxicology later revealed methaqualone in the driver's system. The crime statistics were equally disturbing. While Quaaludes didn't produce the aggressive behavior associated with alcohol or stimulants, the drug trade surrounding them generated enormous violence. Dealers fought over territory, robberies targeted pharmacies and doctors' offices. The illegal labs that produced counterfeit pills were often connected to organized crime syndicates that didn't hesitate to use violence to protect their operations. In 1978, a particularly shocking case made national headlines. A gang in Florida had been producing massive quantities of counterfeit Quaaludes in a clandestine lab. When a dispute arose with a rival group, there was a shootout that left 4 people dead. Police raided the lab and discovered not just the drug operation, but evidence of connections to multiple murders. This wasn't medicine anymore. It was organized crime at an industrial scale. The medical community was finally beginning to wake up. Professional organizations started issuing warnings. Medical journals published studies documenting the addiction potential, the overdose risks, the withdrawal dangers. The American Medical Association called for stricter prescribing guidelines. But the pharmaceutical companies continued to defend their product. They argued that the problems were due to misuse and abuse, not the drug itself. They pointed to the millions of patients who took Quaaludes as prescribed without problems. They lobbied against restrictions. The tension came to a head in the late 1970s. On one side were public health officials, addiction specialists, emergency room doctors, and law enforcement agencies, all calling for Quaaludes to be tightly controlled or banned outright. On the other side were the pharmaceutical manufacturers, some physicians who still believed in the drug's therapeutic value, and, though they would never publicly admit it, the millions of Americans who had come to depend on the drug, either medically or recreationally. The stage was set for a battle over the drug's future, a battle that would play out in congressional hearings, regulatory agencies, and ultimately in the halls of the Drug Enforcement Administration. The question was no longer whether Quaaludes were dangerous. That much was beyond dispute. The question was whether America would have the political will to take them away. The first serious attempt to control Quaaludes came in 1973, when the Drug Enforcement Administration was first formed. The DEA, created from a merger of several other federal drug enforcement agencies, was tasked with classifying and controlling dangerous drugs under the newly passed Controlled Substances Act. Methaqualone was on their radar from day one. The evidence was overwhelming. This was not a safe drug, and it was being widely abused. In that year, the DEA moved to place methaqualone in Schedule 2 of the Controlled Substances Act. Schedule 2 is reserved for drugs with high potential for abuse, but also recognized medical use, drugs like morphine, cocaine, and amphetamine. It's the most restrictive category for drugs that doctors can still prescribe. Being placed in Schedule 2 meant that prescriptions could no longer be refilled. Each one required a new prescription from a doctor. The prescriptions had to be written on special security paper. Pharmacies had to keep detailed records. Doctors had to register with the DEA and could face prosecution for overprescribing. The pharmaceutical industry fought back hard. William H. Rorer Inc., the manufacturer of Quaalude, hired an army of lawyers and lobbyists. They argued that the DEA's evidence was flawed, that the abuse reports were exaggerated, that the drug remained safe when used as directed. They pointed to the millions of prescriptions written annually and argued that the vast majority were for legitimate medical purposes. They claimed that Schedule II classification would deny pain relief and sleep to millions of Americans who needed it. Behind the scenes, the lobbying was intense. Rorer had connections in Congress. They had doctors who would testify on their behalf. They had patient advocacy groups, some genuine, some possibly funded by the company, who wrote letters opposing the reclassification. The message was consistent. Quaaludes were being unfairly targeted, and restricting them would cause more harm than good. Despite this opposition, the DEA prevailed. In 1973, methaqualone was placed in Schedule II. The immediate effect was dramatic. Prescriptions dropped by approximately 40% almost overnight. Doctors, now required to go through the extra paperwork and facing potential DEA scrutiny, became much more cautious about prescribing the drug. Patients who had been getting easy refills suddenly found themselves cut off or having to go through more rigorous evaluations. But the Schedule II classification didn't solve the problem, it just changed it. The black market exploded. With legitimate prescriptions harder to get, users turned to illegal sources. The counterfeit Quaalude industry, which had been growing steadily, went into overdrive. By the mid-1970s, clandestine labs were producing Quaaludes by the millions. The pills flooded into the disco scene, onto college campuses, into suburban communities. The illegal manufacturing took two forms. Some operations were sophisticated, run by organized crime syndicates with access to trained chemists and proper equipment. These labs produced pills that were nearly indistinguishable from pharmaceutical Quaaludes in appearance and potency. They would stamp them with 714 or other pharmaceutical markings to increase authenticity. The quality was often quite good. These were criminal enterprises, but they had standards. A consistent product meant repeat customers. But other labs were crude operations set up in garages, basements, and rented warehouses by people with minimal chemistry knowledge. These operations were dangerous, both to the manufacturers and to the end users. The synthesis of methaqualone involves multiple steps using flammable and toxic chemicals. Poorly controlled reactions could explode. Incompetent purification could leave toxic contaminants in the final product. These pills were a lottery. They might contain too little methaqualone to have any effect, or so much that they could cause an overdose. The DEA found itself fighting a hydra. For every lab they shut down, two more would spring up. The profit margins were enormous. Methaqualone could be synthesized for a few dollars per 100 pills and sold on the street for $5 to $10 per pill. A small operation could generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit per month. And the penalties, at least in the mid-1970s, were relatively light compared to drugs like heroin or cocaine. The international dimension of the problem grew more complex as well. India, where methaqualone had first been synthesized, had become a major producer of the raw chemical and finished pills. The country's relatively lax pharmaceutical regulations and large chemical manufacturing industry made it easy to produce methaqualone in bulk. Indian companies would manufacture the pills ostensibly for domestic medical use or for export to countries where the drug was still legal. But large quantities were being diverted into the black market. The same was true in other countries. Colombia became a major producer, with sophisticated labs producing high-quality methaqualone. The drug would be smuggled into the United States along the same routes used for cocaine and marijuana. The traffickers saw it as a logical expansion of their product line. Same distribution network, same customer base, huge profit potential. By 1978, the situation had reached crisis levels. the DEA estimated that 95% of all Quaaludes in the United States were now from illegal sources. Emergency room visits related to the drug continued to climb. Overdose deaths showed no sign of decreasing despite the Schedule II classification. It was clear that more drastic action was needed. The Carter administration, facing a drug crisis on multiple fronts, began to consider more aggressive options. There were essentially three possibilities. First, they could move methaqualone to Schedule I, the most restrictive category, reserved for drugs with no accepted medical use. This would ban the drug entirely. Doctors couldn't prescribe it, manufacturers couldn't produce it legally, and penalties for possession and distribution would increase dramatically. Second, they could leave it in Schedule II but dramatically increase enforcement efforts against illegal manufacturers and smugglers. This would require more funding for the DEA, more prosecutors, more judges, more prison space, a massive investment in the war on drugs that was already consuming billions of dollars annually. Third, they could try a voluntary withdrawal approach, working with pharmaceutical manufacturers to stop producing the drug while allowing limited prescribing of existing stocks. This was the softer option, relying on cooperation rather than coercion. The debate played out in congressional hearings throughout 1978 and 1979. Senators and representatives heard testimony from DEA officials describing the scope of the illegal trade. Emergency room doctors described the carnage they were seeing. Addiction specialists presented case studies of patients whose lives had been destroyed by Quaalude addiction. Parents of teenagers who had died from overdoses gave emotional testimony. On the other side, pharmaceutical companies continued to argue for the drug's medical value. Some doctors testified that they had patients who benefited from Quaaludes and couldn't tolerate other sleep medications. Civil liberties groups worried about the expansion of government power over personal medical decisions. And there was the economic argument. Rora and other manufacturers employed thousands of workers, and banning methaqualone would mean job losses. The turning point came with a series of investigative journalism pieces. Major newspapers and magazines, including 60 Minutes, ran exposés on the Quaalude crisis. They interviewed young addicts. They documented the role of the drug in sexual assaults. They showed the staggering death toll. They visited disco clubs where Quaaludes were being sold openly. The stories created public outrage and political pressure that could no longer be ignored. In 1980, a study by the FDA provided the final ammunition needed for action. The study concluded definitively that methaqualone had no therapeutic advantages over other sedative hypnotics, particularly the newer benzodiazepines like Valium and Xanax. These drugs, while not without their own problems, were safer in overdose and had less abuse potential than methaqualone. The medical justification for Quaaludes had evaporated. If there were safer alternatives available, why continue to allow a dangerous drug on the market? The pharmaceutical companies saw the writing on the wall. In 1982, under intense pressure from the FDA and facing the possibility of forced withdrawal, Rora voluntarily announced it would stop manufacturing Quaaludes in the United States. Other pharmaceutical companies followed suit. By 1983, domestic production had ceased entirely. The legitimate pharmaceutical supply had been cut off. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the end of one chapter. The illegal trade continued, now with zero competition from legitimate pharmaceuticals, and internationally methaqualone production was about to shift to a new and unexpected location, where it would fuel an entirely different kind of crisis. As American pharmaceutical companies abandoned methaqualone production in the early 1980s, the story of the drug might have ended, at least as a significant public health concern. But drugs, once they enter the global marketplace, rarely disappear completely. They simply migrate, finding new markets, new producers, and new victims. Quaaludes were about to begin a second life, this time on a different continent. South Africa, during the apartheid era, was an isolated nation, a pariah state subject to international sanctions due to its racial policies, but it was also a relatively industrialized country with a sophisticated pharmaceutical industry. And it had a problem: a population subjected to brutal oppression, grinding poverty in the townships, and a social structure that generated enormous stress and trauma. Methaqualone first appeared in South Africa as a legitimate pharmaceutical in the 1960s, just as it had in the United States and Europe. It was prescribed for the same conditions: insomnia, anxiety, and initially under the same assumptions of safety. But as knowledge of its dangers grew internationally, South African regulators were slower to act. The drug remained available and widely prescribed throughout the 1970s and well into the 1980s. When American manufacturers stopped production, South African pharmaceutical companies and, more significantly, illegal manufacturers saw an opportunity. The chemistry was known, the precursor chemicals were available, the global demand was enormous, and South Africa's geographic position made it an ideal production centre for export. It was far from the watchful eyes of American and European drug enforcement agencies, yet it had good ports and transportation infrastructure. The illegal methaqualone trade in South Africa took on a different character than it had in the United States. It wasn't primarily about disco culture or recreational use among the middle class. Instead, it became deeply intertwined with the township communities, the impoverished black and coloured populations living under apartheid. The drug became known by a new name, Mandrax, the old British pharmaceutical name, but more commonly called buttons or mandies. The use pattern was also different. In South Africa, Mandrax was typically not swallowed as pills. Instead, users would crush the tablets into powder, mix it with marijuana, called dagga locally, and smoke it from a pipe made from the broken neck of a bottle, a pipe called a bottleneck or white pipe. This method of administration created a different pharmacological experience, more intense, more immediate, and arguably even more addictive than oral consumption. The apartheid government's response to this emerging drug crisis revealed the racist heart of the regime. When methaqualone use was primarily among white South Africans taking pharmaceutical pills, it was treated as a medical issue, with rehabilitation programs and medical support. But when Mandrax use exploded in the black townships, it was treated as a criminal problem. Police raids, mass arrests, and harsh sentences became the norm. The drug war became another tool of racial oppression. By the mid-1980s, South Africa had become the world's largest producer of illegal methaqualone. Clandestine labs, particularly in the area around Johannesburg, were producing the drug on an industrial scale. Some of these operations were sophisticated, housed in warehouses with professional-grade chemical equipment. Others were crude setups in residential areas, creating hazards for entire neighborhoods. The drug was everywhere in the townships. It was cheap, cheaper than alcohol in many cases. It offered an escape from the grinding reality of apartheid, from the daily humiliations and violence, from the lack of opportunity and hope. For young men in particular, Mandrax became a central part of social life. Groups would gather in shebeens, informal bars, or in private homes, passing the bottleneck pipe, smoking a mixture called white pipe, or sugars, chasing oblivion. The health consequences were catastrophic. Emergency rooms in township hospitals saw a flood of Mandrax-related cases, overdoses, psychosis, injuries from falls and accidents while intoxicated. The drug contributed to the spread of infectious diseases. The shared pipe transmitted tuberculosis, and the behavior while intoxicated led to risky sexual behavior, spreading HIV during the beginning of the AIDS epidemic that would devastate South Africa. The crime connection was also more pronounced than it had been in the United States. Street gangs in Cape Town and Johannesburg controlled much of the distribution network. Mandrax dealing was a violent business, with turf wars, assassinations, and brutal enforcement. The gangs that emerged, groups like the Americans, the Hard Livings, the Junkie Funky Kids, were essentially narcotics cartels, and Mandrax was their primary product. The international trafficking grew sophisticated. Methaqualone from South African labs would be smuggled to other African countries, to Europe, and back to the United States. The smuggling routes took advantage of South Africa's extensive trade networks despite sanctions. The drugs would be hidden in legitimate cargo, shipped inside machinery, buried in containers of agricultural products sewn into clothing. Some was air freighted, some went by sea, some travelled by land across borders that were porous and poorly guarded. India also continued to be a major source. Even as Western countries had moved to ban methaqualone, Indian pharmaceutical companies continued to manufacture it, ostensibly for domestic medical use, but regulatory oversight was weak and large quantities were being diverted to the illegal market. Indian organised crime groups, some with connections to the Mumbai underworld, would arrange for bulk shipments of methaqualone to be sent to Africa, where it would be distributed and potentially re-exported. The DEA and international law enforcement agencies were aware of this global trade, but they were playing whack-a-mole. They would shut down a South African lab and 2 more would open. They would intercept a shipment from India, and the next one would get through using a different route. The drug was simply too profitable, the demand too high, and the enforcement resources too limited. By the late 1980s, estimates suggested that South Africa was producing between 10 and 20 metric tons of methaqualone annually, enough to supply millions of doses. Some of this stayed in South Africa, feeding domestic addiction, but much of it was exported. The United States, despite having banned pharmaceutical production nearly a decade earlier, saw a resurgence of Quaalude availability on the street, now coming from these international sources. The post-apartheid government, which came to power in 1994 with Nelson Mandela's election, inherited this crisis. They faced a massive methaqualone addiction problem, a sophisticated trafficking network, and limited resources to address it. The new government recognized that the drug problem was partly a legacy of apartheid, that the despair and trauma of that era had created fertile ground for addiction. But recognition didn't provide easy solutions. South African authorities launched Operation Recoil in the mid-1990s, a major crackdown on Mandrax production and trafficking. They raided labs, arrested manufacturers, and seized large quantities of the drug and precursor chemicals. The operation was partially successful. It disrupted some major trafficking networks and temporarily reduced availability. But like all supply-side drug enforcement efforts, it didn't address the demand. New producers emerged to fill the vacuum. The international cooperation gradually improved. The United Nations placed increasing pressure on countries still producing methaqualone legally. India, under international pressure, finally tightened regulations on methaqualone manufacturing in the 1990s. By the early 2000s, legitimate pharmaceutical production of methaqualone had virtually ceased worldwide. What remained was an entirely illegal trade, a shadow industry operating outside any regulatory framework. Yet even as production became more difficult and enforcement more effective, Mandrax remained a significant problem in South Africa. The drug had become deeply embedded in certain communities. Generational patterns of use had developed. Fathers who used passed it on to sons. The smoking method, the social rituals around the drug, the cultural associations, all of this created a persistence that law enforcement alone couldn't break. The health impacts accumulated over decades. Studies of long-term Mandrax users showed devastating consequences. The drug caused permanent neurological damage in many users. Cognitive function declined. Memory problems became chronic. Mental health disorders, particularly depression and anxiety disorders, were common. And because the drug was often mixed with other substances, not just marijuana, but also low-quality alcohol, cheap cocaine, and whatever else was available, the damage was compounded. The social cost was equally severe. Mandrax addiction destroyed families. Users would spend money needed for food and rent on drugs. Domestic violence rates were higher in households where Mandrax was used. Children grew up watching their parents smoke white pipes, often beginning to use themselves as teenagers. The cycle perpetuated itself, resistant to intervention, a grinding tragedy playing out across townships and informal settlements. International trafficking in methaqualone has continued into the 21st century, though at reduced levels. Periodic busts still occur. In 2013, South African police seized 2 tons of mandrax worth millions on the street. In 2017, a major lab was discovered in Mozambique, producing methaqualone for the South African market. The drug hasn't disappeared, it's just become harder to find and more expensive. The most recent trend is the emergence of methaqualone in East Africa, particularly in Tanzania and Kenya. The drug is appearing in these countries' growing urban centres, following similar patterns to its earlier spread. Initially among middle-class users seeking a party drug, then filtering down into poorer communities where it becomes a tool of escape from poverty and limited opportunity. The story of Quaalude's international life demonstrates a fundamental truth about drug control. Prohibition without addressing underlying demand simply displaces the problem. The drug that was supposed to be a safe sleep aid became a party drug, then a street drug, then an international trafficking commodity. It migrated from American pharmaceutical labs to Indian manufacturers to South African clandestine labs to East African distribution networks. The molecule remained the same, only the geography changed. To truly understand the Quaalude story, we need to return to the chemistry, to understand what this molecule actually does in the human body and why it proves so difficult to control. Methaqualone's chemical structure is deceptively simple: C16H-N2O, a quinazoline known derivative that a competent organic chemistry student could synthesize. But its effects on the human brain are anything but simple. The drug works primarily by enhancing the action of GABA, as we discussed earlier, but methaqualone has some unique pharmacological properties that distinguished it from other sedative hypnotics. Unlike benzodiazepines, which bind to a specific site on the GABA-A receptor, methaqualone's action is more diffuse. It affects multiple neurotransmitter systems simultaneously, not just GABA, but also dopamine, serotonin, and others. This multi-system action explains some of methaqualone's distinctive subjective effects. The euphoria that users reported wasn't just from GABA enhancement. The drug was triggering dopamine release in the brain's reward circuitry, the same pathway activated by cocaine, amphetamines, and even natural rewards like food and sex. This made it more reinforcing, more likely to be used repeatedly, more addictive than drugs with a simpler mechanism of action. The drug's effects on the cardiovascular system were also unique and particularly dangerous. Methaqualone caused peripheral vasodilation. The blood vessels in the extremities would relax and widen. This created a feeling of warmth and relaxation, but it also meant that blood pressure could drop precipitously, especially when combined with alcohol. This is what made the drug so dangerous in overdose. Users would literally lose the ability to maintain adequate blood flow to the brain and other vital organs. The metabolism of methaqualone was another crucial factor in its danger profile. The liver breaks down methaqualone through a process called hydroxylation, converting it into several metabolites. This process can be overwhelmed by large doses. When the liver's capacity is exceeded, the unchanged drug accumulates in the blood, leading to progressively deeper sedation and eventually to coma and respiratory failure. Moreover, methaqualone induced its own metabolism. Chronic use caused the liver to produce more of the enzymes that break it down. This enzyme induction was the biochemical basis of tolerance. A long-term user's liver would process the drug much faster than a naive user's, requiring higher and higher doses to achieve the same effect. This meant that addiction to Quaaludes progressed not just psychologically, but physiologically, driven by fundamental changes in how the body handled the drug. The withdrawal syndrome, which the pharmaceutical companies had either missed or downplayed, was directly related to these neurological changes. When someone who had been taking high doses of methaqualone for extended periods suddenly stopped, their brain was left with suppressed GABA systems and no external source of sedation. The result was a rebound hyperexcitability. The neurons that had been artificially inhibited would fire wildly. This manifested as anxiety, insomnia, tremors, and in severe cases seizures that could be fatal. What made methaqualone particularly insidious was the speed at which tolerance and dependence developed. Some sedative drugs, like benzodiazepines, could be taken for weeks or even months before significant tolerance developed. With methaqualone, tolerance could develop within days. Users found themselves escalating doses rapidly, chasing the initial effect that became progressively harder to achieve. The brain science of addiction helps explain why Quaaludes were so hard to quit. The drug wasn't just creating a physical dependence through GABA system changes. It was also creating powerful associative memories through dopamine signaling. The brain learned to associate the drug with pleasure, relief, and social connection. These memories became deeply encoded, resistant to extinction. Years after quitting, former users could experience intense cravings when exposed to cues, hearing certain music, seeing pills, even just talking about the drug. Research into methaqualone's neurotoxicity revealed another disturbing truth. Chronic use appeared to cause lasting damage to brain structure and function. Studies using brain imaging showed that long-term methaqualone users had decreased grey matter volume in several brain regions, particularly in the frontal cortex and hippocampus, areas involved in decision-making, impulse control, and memory. Some of this damage appeared to be irreversible, persisting even after years of abstinence. The drug's interaction with other substances was particularly dangerous and poorly understood by most users. The combination of methaqualone with alcohol was synergistic. Each drug amplified the other's depressant effects. 2 drinks plus 2 Quaaludes could produce the same level of central nervous system depression as 6 drinks plus 6 Quaaludes taken separately. This synergy caught many users by surprise and led to countless overdoses. The combination with stimulants, particularly cocaine, created a different kind of danger. Some users would take Quaaludes to counteract the anxiety and jitteriness of cocaine, or vice versa. This speedballing with downers and uppers created enormous stress on the cardiovascular system. The heart would be simultaneously stimulated and depressed, leading to arrhythmias and, in some cases, sudden cardiac death. The research into methaqualone also revealed individual variation in response that made the drug's effects unpredictable. Genetic differences in liver enzyme function meant that some people metabolized the drug much more slowly than others. A dose that was recreational for one person might be fatal for another. There was no way to know in advance how an individual would respond, making every use a gamble. The development of newer sedative drugs with better safety profiles ultimately made methaqualone obsolete from a medical standpoint. Benzodiazepines like Valium, Xanax, and Ativan, while not without their own abuse potential and dangers, were significantly safer in overdose. The newer non-benzodiazepine sleep aids like Ambien and Lunesta offered sedation with even less respiratory depression. The medical need that Quaaludes had once filled was now better served by these alternatives, yet understanding the chemistry doesn't fully explain the cultural phenomenon. Drugs are not just molecules acting on receptors. They're cultural artifacts, loaded with meaning, shaped by the context in which they're used. Methaqualone's chemical properties created the potential for abuse, but it was culture, disco culture, party culture, the culture of pharmaceutical medicine and its promises, that turned that potential into an epidemic. Quaaludes occupy a unique space in American cultural memory. Unlike heroin, which has always been viewed with horror and associated with criminality, or cocaine, which became synonymous with the excesses of the 1980s Wall Street era, Quaaludes are remembered with a strange mixture of nostalgia and dark humor. They've become a symbol of 1970s excess, shorthand for a particular kind of hedonism, glamorous, sexual, slightly dangerous, but also somehow innocent compared to what would come later. This cultural memory is partly a function of who used the drug and how it was depicted in media. Quaaludes were the drug of Studio 54, of beautiful people in fabulous clothes having sophisticated fun. The imagery associated with the drug was glittering disco balls, not dirty needles in abandoned buildings. It was sex, not violence. This aesthetic distance from the grittier realities of drug abuse allowed the drug to be romanticized in retrospect in a way that heroin or crack cocaine never could be. The film and television depictions of Quaaludes have largely reinforced this glamorized image. Perhaps the most famous recent portrayal is in Martin Scorsese's The Wolf of Wall Street, 2013. The film features an extended sequence where Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Jordan Belfort, takes extremely old and potent Quaaludes while at a country club. His complete loss of motor control, the drooling, the inability to speak or walk, it's played for comedy, a slapstick interlude in a film about excess and moral bankruptcy. The scene is simultaneously accurate in showing the severe impairment that high doses cause, and misleading in treating it as purely comic rather than deeply dangerous. Real-life Belfort has spoken about his Quaalude use during his Wall Street years, describing taking dozens of pills per week, mixing them with cocaine and alcohol, using them both to enhance social situations and to come down from cocaine binges. His addiction was profound and nearly fatal, yet the film treats it as part of his wild ride rather than as a tragedy. Earlier films were more circumspect, but still generally portrayed Quaaludes as a recreational drug associated with fun rather than destruction. In Shampoo, 1975, Warren Beatty's character navigates the sexual and social landscape of Beverly Hills, with Quaaludes as background flavor. In Superbad, 2007, a much later film set in the modern day, the teenage characters obsess over obtaining the perfect drug for a party. Their description matches Quaaludes exactly, though they never name it, suggesting the drug's mythical status persists even among those too young to have experienced its heyday. Music has similarly preserved and romanticized the Quaalude era. Disco and funk songs from the 1970s rarely mentioned drugs explicitly, unlike later hip-hop or rock music, but the culture they depicted was inseparable from Quaalude use. More recent music has been more direct. Hip-hop artists have referenced Quaaludes as a symbol of vintage luxury. Drake, A$AP Rocky, and others have name-dropped ludes alongside expensive cars and designer clothes, treating the drug as a status symbol from a bygone era of excess. The romanticization extends beyond entertainment media. In certain circles, particularly among people who lived through the 1970s, there's a wistful nostalgia for the Quaalude era. Online forums devoted to drug history feature threads where older users reminisce about the drug, describing it in glowing terms, insisting that nothing since has matched it. These accounts are selective, focusing on the pleasurable experiences while glossing over the addiction, the overdoses, the lives destroyed. This cultural memory creates a tension with the historical reality. For every person who had carefree fun on Quaaludes, there were others who developed crippling addictions, who suffered through agonizing withdrawals, who never recovered from the brain damage caused by chronic use. For every glamorous night at Studio 54, there was an emergency room somewhere dealing with an overdose victim, a family watching a loved one deteriorate, a young person dead from mixing ludes with alcohol. The drug has also taken on a curious second life as a collectible. Original pharmaceutical Quaaludes, legitimate pills from the 1970s, have become rare artifacts. Some people collect them, not to use, they would have long since degraded, but as historical objects, symbols of an era. Empty prescription bottles, advertisements from medical journals, even the pill presses used to create counterfeits. These items appear in drug paraphernalia museums and private collections, artifacts of pharmaceutical history. The generational divide in attitudes toward Quaaludes is stark. For baby boomers who lived through the 1970s, the drug often evokes personal memories, whether positive or negative. For Generation X, it's a cultural touchstone, something they learned about through movies and music, part of the wild backstory of the previous generation. For millennials and Gen Z, it's increasingly abstract, a historical curiosity, that disco drug from old movies. Yet even as Quaaludes themselves have largely disappeared from the American drug scene, their legacy persists in several ways. First, they stand as a cautionary tale about pharmaceutical safety claims. The story of how a drug aggressively marketed as safe turned out to be highly dangerous has informed regulatory approaches to new medications. The FDA now requires much more extensive long-term safety data before approving sedative hypnotics. Second, the Quaalude epidemic demonstrated the limits of supply-side drug control. Despite being scheduled, despite manufacturers ceasing production, despite massive law enforcement efforts, the drug remained available for years because demand persisted and illegal manufacturers filled the gap. This pattern would repeat with many other drugs, prescription opioids most notably, suggesting that prohibition alone cannot solve drug problems without addressing the underlying reasons people seek chemical escape. Third, Quaaludes helped establish patterns in American drug culture that continue today. The cycle of a prescription drug being marketed as safe, becoming widely prescribed, migrating to recreational use, causing a crisis, and eventually being restricted or banned. This pattern had appeared before with other drugs, but Quaaludes crystallized it. The same cycle would play out with OxyContin, Vicodin, Xanax, and other prescription medications in subsequent decades. The sexual assault connection also left a troubling legacy. The use of Quaaludes as a date rape drug, brought to widespread public attention through the Cosby revelations, contributed to increased awareness of drug-facilitated sexual assault. It spurred the development of drugs like GHB detection coasters and increased vigilance about drink tampering at bars and parties. The cultural conversation about consent and intoxication became more sophisticated partly because of the awareness raised by such cases. Finally, Quaaludes occupy a particular place in the ongoing debate about drug legalization and harm reduction. Advocates for drug policy reform sometimes point to the Quaalude story as evidence that prohibition doesn't work. The drug was banned, but it didn't disappear, and the illegal versions were more dangerous than the pharmaceutical ones had been. On the other hand, opponents of legalization point to the same story as evidence that making dangerous drugs easily available, even through legitimate medical channels, leads to widespread abuse and harm. The truth, as usual, is more complex than either simplistic narrative allows. Quaaludes were both overprescribed by the medical system and widely abused recreationally. The pharmaceutical version was safer than the illegal versions that followed, but still dangerous. Banning production reduced availability and probably saved lives, but it didn't eliminate the drug or the desire for it. The story resists easy morals, reflecting instead the messy reality of drug use, drug policy, and human nature. By the early 1990s, Quaaludes had largely vanished from the American drug scene. The combination of ceased pharmaceutical production, aggressive law enforcement against illegal labs, and international cooperation to restrict precursor chemicals had severely disrupted the supply chain. A drug that had once been everywhere, in medicine cabinets, at parties, in dorm rooms, became increasingly rare. The generation that had made Quaaludes synonymous with partying was aging, moving on to other drugs or into sobriety. The newer generation of drug users in the 1990s had different preferences. The rave scene that emerged in that decade favoured ecstasy, MDMA, and other stimulants over sedatives. The hip-hop influenced drug culture gravitating toward marijuana, codeine cough syrup, and later prescription opioids. Methamphetamine use exploded in rural America. Cocaine remained popular in urban areas. In this shifting landscape, Quaaludes were increasingly seen as an old person's drug, a relic of the disco era. Yet complete disappearance proved elusive. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, sporadic busts continued. In 2000, DEA agents shut down a sophisticated lab in California that had been producing thousands of methaqualone pills monthly. In 2004, authorities in Florida arrested a dealer who had been importing mandrax from South Africa and selling it domestically. These cases grew rarer over time but never completely ceased. The internet age brought a new wrinkle to the Quaalude: story. Online drug forums and communities kept the mythology alive. Users who had never actually taken genuine Quaaludes would ask questions about the drug, seeking to understand what the fuss had been about. Others claimed to have sources, usually overseas, though these were often scams, people selling fake pills or simply taking money and never delivering anything. The dark web drug markets that emerged in the 2010s, following the template of the infamous Silk Road, occasionally featured methaqualone listings. Some were likely legitimate, sourced from the remaining production in South Africa or India. Others were scams or misidentified products. The reviews from buyers who claimed to have received genuine methaqualone described effects consistent with the drug, suggesting that small-scale international trafficking persisted. A curious phenomenon emerged among some drug users: the search for Quaalude alternatives, drugs that might replicate its unique effects. Various substances were tried and promoted as like Quaaludes, certain benzodiazepines taken in specific combinations, muscle relaxants, even veterinary sedatives. None truly matched methaqualone's particular pharmacological profile, but the search continued, driven by the romanticized reputation the drug had acquired. The prescription drug monitoring systems that many states implemented in response to the opioid crisis also revealed interesting data about sedative use patterns. While Quaaludes themselves no longer appeared in these databases, the overall prescribing patterns for sedative hypnotics showed similar warning signs: doctors writing large quantities of pills, patients filling prescriptions from multiple sources, clear signs of abuse and diversion. The drug had changed, but the behavior patterns persisted. The final nail in Quaalude's coffin came from an unexpected source: drug traffickers' rational business decisions. By the 2000s, methaqualone had become simply too difficult and expensive to produce compared to alternatives. The precursor chemicals were heavily restricted and monitored internationally. The synthesis required some chemistry skill and specialized equipment, and the market for sedatives was now satisfied by diverted prescription benzodiazepines and other drugs that were easier to obtain. From a trafficker's perspective, why bother with the complexity of manufacturing methaqualone when you could just as easily divert pharmaceutically produced alprazolam, Xanax, or obtain fentanyl analogues from Chinese labs? The economics no longer favored Quaalude production. In the criminal underworld, as in legitimate business, products that become obsolete eventually disappear from the market. The last major methaqualone seizures in the United States occurred in the early 2010s. After that, the drug effectively vanished from the American drug landscape. DEA reports from 2015 onward don't even mention methaqualone in their national drug threat assessments. It had become so rare as to be statistically insignificant, a rounding error in the grand calculus of American drug use. South Africa remained the exception. As of 2020, Mandrax continues to be a significant drug problem in that country, though even there, use has declined from its peak in the 1980s and 1990s. South African authorities estimate that several 100,000 people still regularly use the drug, primarily in the Western Cape and Gauteng provinces. The social infrastructure around Mandrax use, the dealing networks, the cultural normalization in some communities, the intergenerational patterns, has proven resistant to eradication. Recent South African public health initiatives have tried new approaches beyond pure law enforcement. Harm reduction programs in some townships provide education about safer use practices, not encouraging use, but acknowledging that abstinence-only messaging has failed. Treatment programs have expanded, offering counseling and medical support for those trying to quit. Community-based interventions work to provide alternative activities and support for young people at risk of beginning use. The results have been modest but real. Mandrax use among South African teenagers has declined in recent years. The number of new users appears to be dropping. Whether this represents a true turning point or just a temporary fluctuation remains to be seen. The drug has shown remarkable resilience over decades, repeatedly rebounding when it seemed to be fading away. Globally, methaqualone is now classified as a Schedule I controlled substance under international law, meaning it has no recognized medical use and high abuse potential. Virtually no country allows its medical use. The few remaining pharmaceutical manufacturers that once produced it have long since ceased. the molecule that was synthesized in pursuit of a malaria cure, that became a blockbuster sleep aid, that fueled an era of disco hedonism, has been almost completely relegated to history. Yet in that history lies important lessons. The story of Quaaludes demonstrates how drugs move through cycles of introduction, acceptance, abuse, crisis, and eventually control or elimination. It shows the dangers of pharmaceutical companies prioritizing profit over safety, of marketing claims that outrun scientific evidence. It illustrates how recreational drug use flows through cultural channels, how a drug becomes associated with particular times, places, and subcultures. Most importantly, the Quaalude story reveals the complex relationship between supply and demand in drug use. You can eliminate supply, shut down manufacturers, ban imports, arrest dealers, and significantly reduce a drug's availability. The domestic disappearance of Quaaludes proves that prohibition, backed by sufficient enforcement resources and international cooperation, can work at that level. But demand is harder to address. The reasons people sought out Quaaludes, to sleep, to escape anxiety, to feel confident and sensual, to enhance social experiences, those needs and desires remain. When Quaaludes became unavailable, users didn't stop seeking chemical solutions to these issues. They just moved on to other drugs. The specific molecule changed, but the underlying human impulse toward chemical mood alteration persisted. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the Quaalude saga. As long as human beings face stress, anxiety, sleeplessness, and social inhibition, as long as we live in societies that generate these problems faster than we can address them through non-chemical means, there will be a market for drugs that promise relief. Whether that market is filled by regulated pharmaceuticals, illegal street drugs, or some hybrid, someone will always step in to meet that demand. We began this journey in a laboratory in India in 1951, watching chemists search for a malaria cure and accidentally discover something else entirely. We've traced methaqualone through its transformation from experimental compound to miracle drug to party favor to prohibited substance. We've watched it migrate from American medicine cabinets to South African townships, from disco clubs to congressional hearings. We've seen it destroy lives, fuel an era's hedonism, and ultimately fade into near obscurity. The story of Quaaludes is in many ways a microcosm of the broader American relationship with drugs, both pharmaceutical and recreational. It reveals our desperate desire for chemical solutions to the problems of existence, our willingness to believe that a pill can deliver what life cannot, our tendency to swing between wild enthusiasm and moral panic without ever quite finding a rational middle ground. It also reveals the eternal tension between individual freedom and social harm, between the desire to control dangerous substances and the reality that prohibition has limits. Quaaludes were legal and widely prescribed, and that led to an epidemic of addiction and death. They were banned and heavily restricted, and that drove the trade underground and arguably made it more dangerous. Neither extreme, complete availability nor absolute prohibition, proved to be a solution. The pharmaceutical companies bear significant responsibility for the Quaalude crisis. William H. Rorer Inc. and other manufacturers marketed methaqualone with claims of safety that were not supported by adequate testing. They downplayed or ignored warning signs. They prioritized profit over patient welfare. The billions of dollars they made came at an enormous cost in human suffering. The medical profession also failed its responsibility. Too many doctors prescribed Quaaludes carelessly, accepting pharmaceutical company marketing at face value rather than carefully evaluating the evidence. They wrote prescriptions for marginal indications, refilled them without sufficient monitoring, and were slow to recognize the addiction epidemic developing among their patients. The regulatory agencies, the FDA, the DEA, were reactive rather than proactive, always a step behind the crisis. They relied too heavily on pharmaceutical company data in the approval process. They were slow to schedule the drug as controlled. They struggled to coordinate international efforts to control production and trafficking. But we also can't ignore the role of users themselves. Millions of Americans took Quaaludes recreationally, not for medical reasons, knowing or suspecting that the drug was dangerous. They chased the high, pushed the doses, mixed it with alcohol, and introduced others to the drug. The crisis wasn't just imposed from above by corporations and doctors. It was also driven from below by individual choices to get high. Perhaps what's most striking about the Quaalude story is how preventable it was. The dangers of sedative drugs were well known by the 1960s. The history of barbiturate abuse and overdose was recent and well documented. Yet the same mistakes were made again. Aggressive marketing, loose prescribing, assumption that a new drug would be different from its predecessors. And those mistakes would be repeated yet again with OxyContin and the opioid epidemic that began just a couple of decades later. There's something tragic in this repetition, in our collective inability to learn from history. Every generation seems to believe that its miracle drug will be different, that we've finally found the one that delivers benefits without costs. And every generation is eventually proven wrong, usually at enormous cost in lives and suffering. The current state of addiction treatment owes something to the Quaalude experience. The recognition that addiction is a medical condition requiring treatment rather than solely a moral failing to be punished. This understanding was advanced by the visible middle-class addiction to Quaaludes and prescription drugs. It's harder to demonize addicts when they're suburban housewives and successful professionals, rather than stereotypical street junkies. The harm reduction movement also learned from the Quaalude era. The recognition that drug use will occur regardless of legal status, and that reducing the harms of that use is a valid public health goal, these principles were developed partly in response to crises like Quaaludes. Needle exchange programs, drug testing services, overdose prevention education, all of these interventions acknowledge that prohibition alone won't eliminate drug use, so we must work to make it safer. Yet these lessons remain contested. American drug policy continues to swing between prohibition and permission, between punitive approaches and medical models, without ever quite committing fully to either. We continue to allow aggressive pharmaceutical marketing while professing surprise when drugs are overprescribed. We continue to rely heavily on law enforcement while chronic underfunding treatment. The contradictions that the Quaalude crisis revealed remain unresolved. The human cost of the Quaalude epidemic is impossible to calculate precisely. How many people died from overdoses? How many developed addictions that destroyed their relationships, careers, health? How many were sexually assaulted while incapacitated by the drug? How many were imprisoned for possession or distribution? The numbers are large. Thousands dead, hundreds of thousands addicted, millions affected. But they're ultimately just statistics, abstractions that can't capture the individual tragedies, the specific lives cut short or permanently damaged. For the families of those who died, for the individuals who struggled for years to overcome addiction, for those who bear the lasting cognitive damage from chronic use, for them, the Quaalude story isn't history, it's personal. It's the loss they continue to carry, the damage they continue to manage, the what-ifs and if-onlys that haunt them still. As we sit here in 2025, more than 40 years after the last pharmaceutical Quaalude was manufactured in the United States, the drug has largely faded from public consciousness. Young people have never heard of it. Middle-aged people vaguely remember the name from movies or their parents' medicine cabinets. Only older Americans who lived through the era retain clear memories of what Quaaludes meant and what they did. This fading is natural and probably inevitable. Drugs, like all cultural phenomena, have their moment and then recede. The specific molecule, the brand name, the cultural associations, these become history, preserved in archives and academic studies rather than lived experience. But the underlying dynamics that created the Quaalude epidemic haven't disappeared. The pharmaceutical industry continues to develop and market new drugs, some of which will inevitably be abused. People continue to struggle with anxiety, insomnia, stress, and the desire for pleasurable experiences. The tension between medical use and recreational use, between individual freedom and social welfare, Between prohibition and availability, these tensions remain, generating new crises around new drugs. Methaqualone, that molecule synthesized in search of a malaria cure, turned out to be a Pandora's box. It promised relief from sleeplessness and anxiety, and for a time, it delivered. But it also brought addiction, death, crime, and social disruption on a massive scale. The promise and the peril were inseparable, two sides of the same chemical coin. The Complete History of Quaaludes is not just a story about a drug, it's a story about human nature, our desire for easy solutions, our willingness to believe what we want to believe, our capacity for both pleasure-seeking and self-destruction. It's a story about corporate greed, medical fallibility, regulatory failure, and the limits of prohibition. It's a story about a particular moment in American culture, the 1970s, when certain possibilities seemed to open up, when the old rules seemed to be crumbling, when a little white pill seemed to embody both liberation and decay. Most fundamentally, it's a reminder that every drug, every chemical that alters consciousness or physiology, carries both potential benefits and inevitable risks. The challenge, still unmet, perhaps unmeetable, is to find ways to maximize the former while minimizing the latter, to harvest the gifts of pharmacology without being destroyed by them. The disco balls have stopped spinning. Studio 54 is long closed, now just a story old-timers tell about the days when New York was wild and dangerous and exciting. The pills stamped with Rora 714 have crumbled to dust, or been flushed away or locked in evidence rooms, relics of another age. The people who made them, sold them, prescribed them, and took them have mostly moved on or passed on. But the human problems that Quaaludes were supposed to solve, the sleeplessness, the anxiety, the inhibitions, the desire to feel different than we feel, those remain. We still seek chemical solutions. We still believe, despite all evidence to the contrary, that the next miracle drug will be different, that we've finally found the one without the dark side. Maybe we should stop looking for miracles. Maybe we should recognize that every powerful drug is a bargain with hidden costs, that the relief comes with a bill that will eventually come due. Maybe we should address the underlying conditions, the stress, the alienation, the lack of meaning and connection that drive people to seek chemical escape in the first place. Or maybe that's too much to ask. Maybe the desire to alter consciousness, to escape the prison of our default state, is too fundamental to human nature to ever be suppressed or sublimated. Maybe the best we can do is try to make the inevitable drug use as safe as possible, to reduce the harms while acknowledging that we can never eliminate the urge. The story of Quaaludes offers no easy answers to these questions. It simply lays bare the contradictions, the costs, and the consequences of our complicated relationship with drugs. It's a history worth knowing, a story worth telling, not because it provides solutions, but because it illuminates the problems we continue to face. The pills are gone, but the questions remain, and somewhere, in some laboratory, someone is probably synthesizing the next molecule that will promise everything and deliver something far more complicated. The pattern repeats. The lesson, unlearned, waits to be taught again. Good night.